I think you and Ray published the largest number of issues of Amazing of any other editor. I saw that statistic. Yeah?
I think 80, quite a few more years ago.
Yeah. I know you guys were similar in time, but I think also in history. So Ted is a longtime science fiction writer. He edited both Amazing and Fantastic. What was it, from '69 until the late '70s?
Cover date wise, from early 69 to early 79, but actually from October 68 to October 78.
Okay.
10 years virtually to the day.
All right. A lot of people think that that was a golden age of amazing stories, including me. He did a wonderful job of a magazine that was kind of not due to what was mostly a reprint magazine when he took it over. Didn't have a big budget, and he made do. He used his contacts in the world of art and writing to get good quality stories and covers.
I use my friends.
There you go. And I've said enough. It's his turn.
Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate the honor of this guest of honorship. And this is a new venue for me. It's my first PulpFest, my first pulp convention of any kind. But I've been on the Pulp Mags list for years. And I know a lot of you by name. And since this weekend, some of you by face. So that's always interesting and fun. Kind of reminds me of the first SF convention I went to when I was still in high school. I knew all these people who I got in their fanzines, but their faces were total mystery. So it's the same experience 60-odd years later. I got started in science fiction because I was a reader. Now, I think that is probably true of whether you're in science fiction or not. Just about everybody in this room. We're all here because we read. That is the essence of what pulps and everything else that surrounds them is concerned with. I was not a precocious reader. I learned to read in the first grade, even though my mother was a kindergarten teacher and she had me in her school. But she didn't believe in pushing things. Nonetheless, she herself read quite a lot to us kids. She read Winnie the Pooh and books like that very well. Got me interested in the whole concept of stories long before I could read. And I went to my church, had a library, a very small library. It was a little bookcase with, I don't know, 2 or 3 dozen books in it, max. But they were all kids' books. One of them was The Land of Oz. And I loved the pictures in it. I took the book home and demanded that my mother read it to me. She read it to me maybe a chapter a day, which had me just sitting on tenterhooks from one reading to the next, wondering what was going to happen next. So I had an incentive to learn to read, and my mother gave me a book called Jack the Giant Killer. And that was, she said, I want you to read 2 pages a day. Well, I finished the whole book the first day she gave it to me. And that was where my reading really started. It started with fantasy. It started with a fairy tale, in essence. So my earliest fiction that I enjoyed reading were the Oz books and associated fantasy and fairy tales. Books like the Lang's different colored anthologies of fairy tales and all the classic Grimm, Anderson, and so forth. And I had used these up by the time I was in 2nd grade. And also on that shelf of books at the church library were a bunch of boys' books dating from early in the 20th century. Not the famous ones like the Hardy Boys or Tom Swift, but books like the Motorcycle Boys and the Motorboat Boys and the This, That, and the Other Boys. And although they were parts of series, I would only find one book from each series in this library, which was tiny. But I read them all Many of them I read several times over. In fact, I would say the first 3 years I was reading books, half of what I read was a reread. But that was my beginning with reading. I discovered science fiction when I was in the 3rd grade with a British book called The Angry Planet by John Keir Cross. It was exciting enough to me that I read it twice before I gave it back to the library. But in hindsight, it wasn't good science fiction. These 2 kids land on Mars and walk around breathing the Martian air without difficulty. That's a stretch. But you know, it told me that there was something out there that wasn't fairy tales, but was fantastic. And the next year, when I was in 4th grade, Robert Heinlein published his first juvenile, Rocket Ship Galileo. And I got that from my public library and read it. And that did it. That closed the switch for me for all time. It turned me into a science fiction reader and fan. As soon as I finished the last page of that book, I turned back to the first page and reread it. It was compulsively readable on a level I had not previously encountered in my short reading career. And from that point on, as new Heinlein juveniles were published, I took each one from the library and read it. And eventually I was 10, 11, 12 years old, and I was noticing that there were science fiction magazines out there. I hung out at my local drugstore and newsstands, but for comic books mostly. And of which I am also a big fan of. But then I noticed a copy of Astounding Science Fiction. This had to have been when I was no older than 10. I picked it up and I looked at it and I thumbed through it and I thought, I'll probably be able to get into this in another 2 or 3 years, but this is not for me yet. I'm not old enough for this. It was over my head as I perceived it. So I continued to get books out of the library, Groff Conklin's anthologies, the Galaxy Readers, stuff like that. And in the summer of 1951, a friend of mine who lived down the street said, I hear you like science fiction. I've got a science fiction book you can have. And he handed it to me. And it was not a book. It was a magazine. It was an issue of Astounding from the year before, from somewhere around August or September of 1950. Well, I thought, here I am again, confronted with something that may be over my head, but now I'll give it a shot. I'll try it. I was 13. And I read that entire issue, and parts of it, I won't say they were over my head so much as I didn't find them very interesting. You know, they were on a level of political intrigue that hadn't reached me yet at that age. But as soon as I had read it, I thought to myself, there are more of these out there. And I got on my bicycle and I rode to my nearest drugstore, of which there were a half dozen in my area. And I discovered that in the interim, Astounding had gone up in price from 25 to 35 cents. This was no small thing for a boy on a small allowance. But I picked up the latest issue of Astounding, and while I was there, I looked at the other digest-sized science fiction magazines. And I think that was when I bought Galaxy. I don't think I found F&SF yet. I think that waited another month. But the Galaxy said that coming in the next issue was a brand new serial by Robert A. Heinlein. Oh boy, I said. That was the Puppet Masters, by the way, a damn good book, or serial. I said to myself as I bought the first issue with the serial in it, I said, I will save these until I have all, I guess it was 3 installments, and then I'll read it straight through. Well, that resolution lasted less than half a day. And then I read that installment and waited breathlessly for months for the next. And this suckered me in. And my reading was voracious. At that time, I was not a speed reader, but I read an awful lot. And by the time I was in high school, I was reading an average of 3 books a day. Although one of those, or 2 of those, might actually be magazines rather than books. They had the same amount of words, 68,000 words. And so, in the first week of my reading science fiction magazines, I had cleaned out all the digest science fiction magazines I could find. I did not initially find Imagination. I did not initially find Otherworlds. They weren't distributed in Falls Church then. But I found everything I could, and it wasn't enough. I was hooked. I needed my fix. I had to look at the pulps. Now, in my family, which was a solid middle-class family with my mother a teacher, pulps were not respected. That's the kindest way I can put it. Pulps were regarded as trash by everyone I knew. Teachers, family, even acquaintances, school friends. Everybody thought that pulps were what people who could never read beyond comic books actually graduated to when they got older. And that they still required you to move your lips while you read. It was a pretty bad image, reinforced by rough teaser ads on the back covers, and ads for Rosicrucians, Amorc, not the real Rosicrucians, of course, but the money-grubbing ones. And, you know, it took me a while to work up my nerve to look at a pulp magazine, even though, once I started reading, I found the contents were interchangeable with the digest. I mean, accounting for editorial distinctions and preferences, but basically science fiction and startling and thrilling wonder was every bit as good as this science fiction and Galaxy and Astounding, if not better, to my taste then. I mean, where did you find Fletcher Pratt and Sprague DeCamp most often? And a lot of others. Well, by then, having made the big leap, I think I started with Startling and Thrilling Wonder and the standard group, and I quickly found all the others. I was influenced by things like Columbia Publications had the worst paper in the world. It was blotter paper. It wouldn't take art worth a damn and barely took type. But you could blot your butt with it. And, you know, that was off-putting to a kid who had all of these irrelevant standards. The fiction in it was still good, however, so, okay, add that to the slot. Planet Stories, my God, it was published by Love Romances Incorporated when you are a 13-year-old kid. That is anathema. That's the last thing you want is a love pulp. But I bought it too. And in fact, later I had letters published in it. There was a really neat thing about Planet Stories. A few other magazines did it, but Planet did it more openly and better. There was a contest among the readers for who had written the best letter in every issue. And the first, second, and third place winners of that contest received original artwork from the issue in which their letters had appeared. I had 2 letters published in Planet. Unfortunately, the last one was in the final issue. No chance of winning that. But I won second place for the first letter. And I got a very nice Kelly Freas original double-page spread for it.
Wow.
Which I really appreciated. Because at that time, I was studying to be an artist. I hadn't yet realized I could write or edit. And when I went to my first World Science Fiction Convention in '55, I was able at the auctions there to buy up original material artwork fairly cheaply by people famous like Paul Calais, great scratchbook. And I bought all these to look at them and analyze them and figure out how they had done them, you know, the techniques involved, the scratchboarding, the pen techniques, the brush techniques, all of which I was learning. But Planet, my letter in the final issue of Planet, I believe was published for only one reason. In that letter, I told the editor what he needed to do with the magazine if it was not to fold. and it appeared in the issue, the last issue. So obviously my advice was not taken, but I did spell out the reasons why it wasn't going to succeed as a pulp. Because by then, which was what, 53, 54, somewhere in there, pulps were falling by the wayside right and left. Some were converting to digests, like the Columbia magazines, but a lot of them just stopped. Thrilling, Wonder, and Startling just stopped. That was a crime. But, you know, everything changes. Publishing moves on. Even at 13 or 14, actually I probably might have been 15 by the time I was writing those letters to Plank, I was trying to understand the publishing industry. I was trying to figure it out, what worked, what didn't. I was very young, I was very naive, but I didn't have terrible ideas. And that informed that letter to Final Planet. Well, by then, I was a science fiction fan. And what that means is not that I just like to read a lot of the stuff. It meant I was a member, an active member of a community called Science Fiction Fandom, which came into existence somewhere around 1930 and had built up over the years from a few dozen people into a few hundred. We all knew each other. Not that different from Pulp Fandom. We all knew each other. We corresponded. We put out fanzines, and we went infrequently to conventions, because there were very few conventions, and a Worldcon and one or two regionals, that was it. Now you can go to one every weekend if you really want to. But I was a very active fan, and by 1955 I was putting out fanzines, I was contributing to other people's fanzines. And in 1955 I went to my first Worldcon, and I was at a room party. Now that's something you don't seem to have here at PulpFest, and I think it might be an aspect of why everybody goes home so early on Sundays and stuff like that. You don't have room parties. You really should think about it. They're fun. That's their only purpose. You get together with half a dozen people you like, you hang out, you talk, and maybe have a few drinks, and you're socialized. That was the whole point of it. And so I sit down on a bed in a small room party next to a fellow who turns out to be Larry Shaw. And Larry Shaw is about to edit his first science fiction magazine. He'd been a fan for 10 or 15 years by then. But he was a member of the original Futurians. But he was about to put out a magazine called Infinity Science Fiction, a digest-sized magazine. And he had with him page proofs of the first issue, essentially a loose wraparound cover and unbound pages of the issue, staple, print, all that. And he showed them to me. And here I am, this pretty new fan who's at that point 16 years old. And this man, who is a grown man, who is an editor in the field, somebody whose name I've heard of and respect, is treating me more or less like an equal. I thought that was incredible. That did a lot for me. And Larry became a good friend. I later worked for him. I did books for him. Back when he was editing auto magazines, I used to drive cars to car testers for him. Great guy. And his willingness to befriend a naive, innocent kid was a great lesson to me about what science fiction fandom in general are all about. And I would say that was one of the things that gave me a strong nudge in the direction that my career took. I wasn't at that time still thinking of myself as a writer or editor. I still thought of myself as a wannabe artist. But I was starting to realize I wasn't a very good artist, not as good as I thought I should be at least. And fanzines had gotten me to editing and writing, per se. You know, not very well, but you keep doing it, you pick it up. You learn. And I was in the process of learning all of that. Well, at the same time, I used to mow both my yard and my grandmother's yard next door, which were rather large. And I had a lot of time to daydream while I was following that lawnmower around those yards. And I used to plan science fiction magazines in my head. I used to write the editorials for them. I used to design the contents page layouts, all in my head. And I got to say, everything I wrote in my head was better than anything I was able at that time to actually write on paper. But it was a dream of mine to become a science fiction pro. And I didn't quite know how I was going to accomplish this, but it lay up there in the future of when I'm grown up. And I took a slight detour. When I was 21, I moved to New York City. I was then married to a lovely young woman named Sylvia. And we went to New York City to live there. We found an apartment in Greenwich Village, 4th floor walk up, no elevators. And Sylvia's parents told us that they understood that we were going through a phase by living in Greenwich Village, but we would work through it, they were sure. We were there because that's where we found the place. We looked all over Manhattan for a place. I looked at a place that was going for $45 a month, that was at the bottom of an air shaft, had some furniture left in it, and I opened a drawer in the dresser, and there were World War II ration books in that drawer. That's rent control for you. But we didn't take that place. That was too grim. I moved to New York City thinking I was going to become a jazz critic, because I was also a big fan of jazz. I've been reading jazz writing for more than 5 years by then, listening to lots of music, and I started writing my own record reviews for my own fanzines. I thought, this is something I can do. I don't know whether I can write science fiction or not, but this is something I can do. And I did. I became a jazz critic, professional jazz critic, writing for Metronome and Jazz Guide, a few other places. And I made a splash. I was very successful initially because I wrote the first definitive piece about a man named Ornette Coleman, who was just then coming up in the public consciousness as a new jazz artist. And Coleman, a few months later, said publicly in an interview that it was the most receptive piece written about him. Well, that didn't hurt. So I was a jazz critic for several years. But in the course of that, I discovered an unfortunate fact. There were 6 or 8 of us young jazz critics in New York City at that time, writing for the jazz publications, doing minor notes for records and stuff like that. And one day, Joe Goldberg was one of them, and I sat down and figured out the economics of what we were doing. And we figured the field would actually support only 4 of us. There wasn't that much money around. Doing liner notes for a record album, that was good for $75. My record reviews for Metronome magazine paid $5 a piece, and they wanted the records back, which I thought was insane. Along with the ones I liked, I'd go out and buy my own copies. But then I figured out I'd get myself on the freebie list of the record companies, which is another nice game. And nonetheless, I couldn't see the career going anywhere. I had accomplished the most I could accomplish in the first 2 years I've been doing it, and there wasn't going to be much more money. Even the guys like Nat Hentoff and Leonard Feather, who were the big pros in the field, they weren't getting much money either. In fact, Nat had dropped jazz criticism for writing political columns. Very nice man, by the way. Treated me very well. So I started thinking about science fiction again. And a friend of mine and I were walking down 7th Avenue in New York one day, summer of 1961. And we started analyzing what we liked and disliked about A.E. Van Vogt. I hope most of you are familiar with him, Slan, Weapon Shops of Issuer Worlds in L.A. and all the rest of them. He had a unique quality, one of which was that every 800 words he introduced a new concept or idea. That's not as easy as it sounds. So after we had spent a half hour or more talking about this, I was all fired up, and I went back to my apartment, sat down at a typewriter and began to write something, trying to follow these Van Voogtian principles that I had arrived at. One of which, of course, was the new idea of 800 words, which, wow, by the second or third 800 words, that gets harder. Unless you're just willing to pull rabbits out of the hat and just go off into left field, which occasionally Van Vogt did successfully, but I wasn't that comfortable. But I wrote 2 or 3 or 4 really short chapters into this thing, and then I let it sit a little bit. Then my marriage with my first wife was breaking up, and I sat down at a typewriter and wrote a story about a man whose body caught on fire. It didn't hurt him, which sort of described metaphorically what I was going through at the time. And when I finished it, I did finish it as a complete short story. I sent it off to a few publications and got rejected. So then I thought, I know Marion Zimmer Bradley. We're pretty good friends. Years earlier, she had told me that I had good ideas, but I needed to learn how to stretch them out into real stories rather than synopses. And I asked her if she would like to have a look at the story I had written, which I called Phoenix, I think, or New Phoenix, I'm not sure now. And she ran it through her typewriter once, sent it over to her agent, Scott Meredith, and it sold for amazing that August as Phoenix. And the very same day that I heard about that sale, I heard about the sale of another story of mine, which was called I Executioner. And I Executioner was based on taking the beginning that I'd written of my Van Voogtian book and turning it into a short story. Again, I didn't quite have the confidence in my own writing abilities at that point, so I asked my friend Terry Carr, who was selling stories to FNSF at the time, if he would like to run it through his typewriter once. He did, and we sold it to IF. We got the notification of sales the same day, and both stories were published on the same day in January of 1963 in If and Amazing. So I don't know which was my first sale. But I had gotten this idea from Bob Wilson Tucker, a science fiction and mystery writer, who often took openings of novels and turned them into short stories, or did the reverse, took short stories and turned them into the openings of novels. He did this with A Long Loud Silence and several other of his novels. And I thought, that's really economical. That's getting twice as much value out of something you've written. I want to do that too. So that's what I did, you know. That's how I Executioner and Phoenix came about. And once I had done that, well, Terry and I had written a book together called Invasion from 2500, which is exactly what it sounds like. Terry was then working for Scott Meredith as an agent, and he told me one day that a fellow named Charlie Heckelman, whom some of you will recognize as a pulp writer in the 40s, early 50s, had started up a book publishing company called Monarch Books. And like other people who had good ideas but not very much money, one of them being Harvey Kurtzman, he went to a really scabby company known as Charlton. Charlton were a comic book publisher who were run by the mob. I mean, totally. DC was owned by the mob, but Charlton was run by the mob. They imported their artists from Italy. They didn't speak English, and they kept them in what amounted to laboring villages, you know, like where you don't pay them quite enough to pay their rent, but they're paying the rent back to you, so you've got them in permanent bondage. That's how Charlton made his move into comics and being a rather fourth or fifth rate sheet publisher of music, sheet music publisher in the 40s. That's where their start was. They also were their own distributor And they had a very interesting way of getting their comics when they started onto newsstands. They would tell newsstand owners, buy at our usual rates, some percentage of the cover price, the first 5 copies, and any you sell over that, you keep it all. So if you take 10 or 15 copies of a particular title and you sell the first 5, and then you sell the rest, you keep all the rest. Well, we're talking 10-cent comic books here. And each one was probably, the profit margin was 2 or 3 cents. But nonetheless, it adds up with volume. And this was how Charlton became an established publisher of comic books, how they got their toe in the door, so to speak. Well, by the late 50s, they were bankrolling Charlie Heckelman at Monarch Books. They were bankrolling Harvey Kurtzman with, what was it? Trump, I think, which lasted a dozen or so issues. But Harvey and all the artists that he brought in with him as co-owners all lost their shirts. Charlton didn't lose any money at all. Now, where Monarch Books was concerned, Charlton felt that Monarch was doing pretty well, and therefore they wanted a bigger chunk of it. They had 49%, Charlie had 51%. So they decided they wanted 51%. And they told Charlie, either you give us this additional percentage of ownership, or we're just going to shut you down. Well, you may notice that Monarch Books went out of business in the early middle 60s, and that's why. But before that happened, Charlie Heckelman decided to launch a little SF line with Monarch, and he called up Terry Cart and Scott Meredith and arranged for Terry to assign books to a half dozen Scott Meredith writers. And these books had to be based around very simple science fiction concept, just one SF concept. So we have, what would happen if the world froze? What would happen if the world was flooded? What would happen if, like that? And after Terry had finished telling me this, I said, gee, the only one that you didn't come up with is the invasion from future. And he said, you're right. And then we decided we would write that one ourselves. So that's how Invasion from 2500 got written. And it taught me how to write a book. I've never written anything half that long before. I mean, my God, 60,000 words. It might have been only 45,000, I'm not sure. I think it was 60. I had never written anything more than 5,000 or 6,000 words. And Terry told me that I should write the first draft and he would do the second draft, which is how we've been working up to there anyway. So I had to figure out how to write the first draft of the whole book. And I decided, well, we'll divide it up into chapters. Outline, chunk it up into neat little, smaller, more doable goals. Just write a chapter, that's 3,000 words. I can do that. And I discovered I could do one every day. Particularly since I was only writing the first draft. I could just zip right through it. If I made mistakes, that were up to Terry to clean up. Or so and so. Well, when I saw what Terry had finally done, he'd done a little bit of rewriting the spots, but mostly he'd just done little editing by hand things on my manuscript and given it to his wife to retype. And when I saw that, I said to myself, I could have done that. I can do that. And that's when I decided to sell my first book. So what did I do? I took I Executioner and I sold it as Android Avenger to Ace Books. And I took Phoenix, and I sold Lancer Books as Phoenix Prime, which was originally just a working title order, but he liked it, so he kept it. And of course, Lancer Books was being edited by my old pal Larry Shaw. Maybe 10 years or so after I first met him, I'm selling him books now. Cool. Well, by then, I had also gotten my foot in the editorial end of things. See, all of this is social. Absolutely all of this is social. I never got a job cold by applying for it. ever. Every job I've had was because somebody wanted me to have it, or it was somebody I knew and I could ask them and they'd say, oh yeah, sure. And that's how I got the job with the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. Auburn Davidson was a good friend of mine. The first day he got the job of editing FNSF, he came over to my place, and I was the first person he told the news to. And Terry Carr was there, and Terry said, I've got these short stories, would you like to read them? And by God, Auburn bought 2 of them on the spot, which is how Terry got involved in FNSF initially. Well, Auburn was then living in New York City, but he moved up to Milford, Pennsylvania, which is where Damon Knight and James Blish and Virginia Kidd, and what were later known as the Milford Mafia, all lived. So Auburn moved up there with his wife Grania. And he would occasionally have parties up there that he would invite us in New York City to. And I was the only person that most of us knew who had a car, because you don't really need one in New York City. And so I would provide the transportation up there. And on the occasion of one party, this must have been in early 1963, I'm there with a friend of mine who has a complaint for Auburn. He said, I sent you a story submission on Monday and I got it back in the mail Wednesday. Did you see it? And Auburn said, no, of course not. That was, we had a slush pile reader, and we discovered that he was simply taking the manuscripts and putting them with direction slips into the return envelopes without reading them. And just dropping them in the mailbox on the corner of 53rd Street where the FNSF offices were. And so they had fired him. And I said, my ears perked up, and I said, gee, Auburn, do you think I could do that? Auburn said, I don't see why not. And that's how I became an assistant editor of FNSF. That's simple. Now, there was more to it after that. There was actual work involved. I was very proud of the fact that out of the FNS slush pile, which averaged 600 manuscripts a month, I found at least one publishable story. I usually passed anywhere from 2 or 3 up to a half dozen up the chain, the editorial chain, Auburn, or later Ed Furman. But at least one would actually be bought. And it became a regular thing. Every issue of FNSF from late 1963 up through 66, 67 has a slush pile story in every issue. So 1 out of every 600 stories per month did make it into the magazine. And that pleased me. Of course, in the process, I read an awful lot of stuff you're just should be grateful you will never see. There was this one woman who was sending me a story a day. They were frankly crackpot. They were, you know, ufology carried yet another step into the occult. And they made no sense as stories at all. They were just mindless ramblings, but she sent one every day. And, you know, and of course, I'm only going into FNSF once a week to pick up manuscripts, so there'd be 3 or 4 of them in each batch. And then finally, one day came when I opened one of hers, and there was a letter in it saying, if you don't buy this story, I'm never going to send you any more. Well, all right. But FNSF was a good training ground for me. After Auburn left and Ed Furman took over, Ed had been in the office every day. The FNSF office was a room behind a rental agency on the ground floor in an apartment building on 53rd Street in Manhattan. You had to go all the way through, past all the reception secretaries and whatever else they had been in the rental offices before you got to the FNSF offices. It wasn't like they had their own entrance. But when I was there, Ed Furman would be there, and I just made a subway ride in from Brooklyn. I want to sit down and chat for a bit before I go back. And years later, Ed told me that that was an invaluable learning experience for him there. I was telling him all the stuff that he didn't know about what was going on in the field at that point. that he needed to know, that he was grateful for work. And he gave me copy editing work, he gave me blurbing, occasional book reviews. I actually wrote several editorials upon request about assigned topics. And it was great. At one point, Joseph Furman, Ed's father, who was the owner-publisher of FMSF, he had been part of a larger combine, Mercury Press, which originally had a radio show and published Ellery Queen and Jonathan Press books and Mercury Press books, digest-sized paperbacks in the 40s. It's where a lot of Dashiell Hammett collections first appeared and ended up in jail. And at some point, Ziff Davis's son set up his own publishing company, Davis Publications. And he bought Ellery Queen from Joe Furman. And at that point, Joe was down to one magazine, which wasn't very viable for any publisher. And he had tried Venture SF in the very late 50s, but that had not been a success. And now Ziff Davis wanted to sell Amazing and Fantastic. And so Joe entered the bidding for them. And the understanding I had with Ed was that I would get at least one of them to edit. Probably Fantastic, probably not Amazing. But, suddenly there would be 3 magazines instead of 1. And so the people worked, and I would probably get one. Those thoughts buoyed me for several months. But Joe Furman did not buy Amazing and Fantastic. Saul Coleman did. I guess his bid was better. I don't know. Now, Saul Coleman was a man who at that point was the masthead credited publisher of Galaxy, If, and Worlds of Tomorrow. In fact, he had created the title Worlds of Tomorrow. And previous to that, he'd started out at DC Comics when he was 18 years old. When EC Comics was formed, he moved to EC as the business manager. When MC Gaines, the original owner of EC, died, and his son Bill Gaines wasn't interested in comics for more than a year, it was Saul who ran the company and changed Bat and Slat into Crime Patrol. Got the company a little more successful. And so that was the beginning of EC. Then he had moved to Avon at some point. He was involved in the Avon Science Fiction and Fantasy Reader, digest-sized magazine in the early 50s, which he said, although his name was honored as the editor, he wasn't the real editor. I don't think Saul was ever an editor, really. He was more a publisher and a business guy. But he and a silent partner named Arthur Bernard, and some of this is, by the way, in the magazine we're all given here. It's an article I wrote, so I don't want to recapitulate needlessly. But Arthur Bernard was the money man. Saul didn't have any money. I mean, not on the level of buying publications. And Arthur had gotten his current business model, let's put it this way, I'm not sure exactly how he started. He had been in pulps on some fringe level for a while. But in the 50s, he bought some of the trashier men's sweat magazines. And his business model was not to buy any new material for them, just to cut up the old issues and reassemble them as new issues. Literally, with scissors and Scotch tape. It must have looked awful. I never saw any. But that was his business model, and that's what he sold Saul Cohen on for Amazing and Fantastic. Ziff Davis had only one asset to sell, and that was the rights to all the stories that Amazing had ever told. Because Ziff Davis, like the publisher before it, Tech, and maybe even Gersbach, I don't know, bought all rights, not first rights. I mean, they're called serial rights. When you publish a story in a magazine, even if it's a short story, not serialized, and you can talk about first North American serial rights, or you can talk about world serial rights, and you can talk about first use rights and second use rights or all use rights. I don't think any of them, with the exception of Street and Smith, bought book rights. I know some of the Astounding authors had trouble selling their serials from Astounding as books because Astounding, this is in the 40s, claimed, Street and Smith claimed that they owned the book rights and the right to first refusal. So they would have to refuse the book as a book before it could be offered to anyone else. Well, in fact, Ziff Davis didn't own as many rights as they thought they did, but they told us all they did. What they didn't know was that Ray Palmer had been cutting side deals with most of his regular writers in the 40s. But I don't think any of that applied to the early 50s stuff that appeared in the first digest of Amazings and Fantastics, which were high-budget material by big names. You know, originally, Amazing was supposed to go slick in 1950, and Howard Brown bought a whole lot of 5 and 10 cent a word big-name writers for it. And then the Korean War happened, and Amazing did not go slick. But that's the material that appeared in the first digest of Amazings in 53. And that's why they had it. They've been sitting on it for 3 years. In any event, Saul takes over the magazines, puts them on a mostly reprint basis. And you probably know all you need to know about that. 3 successive editors suffered for this: Joe Ross, Harry Harrison, and Barry Balsworth. Well, when Saul hired me, I had a somewhat different attitude towards the magazines than Joe or Harry or Barry had, because I was a fan. Because I had always wanted to edit my own prosing, and I had ideas for what I wanted to do with them. And this was exciting. And the fact that I was going to be paid peanuts was not essential. I mean, it's not like FNSF was paying me well. FNSF paid me $35 a month throughout the 60s. That's pocket change even then. But it was what I wanted to do, and it wasn't all I was doing. I was also writing books. I was selling books. By the end of the 60s, I'd had more than a dozen books published. I think I averaged 2 a year from about 64 on, but it didn't really work out to the average. 66, I did 4. And I always thought of myself as a fast writer because I had found this model of writing a chapter a day, and it worked. This meant I could write a book in 3 weeks, which was fine. Except then I didn't feel like doing any more of that for a few months. I was burned out from it. It's an intense thing. I lived the book I was writing. I barely did anything else except eat and sleep. And when I slept, I dreamed. And if the dreams were any good, they went into the book along with everything else. You know, you use what you got. But in the process of doing that, well, a lot of you have brought books up to me to autograph. And virtually all of you who have read them tell me you like them. So I know I did something right. And basically what I think I did right was I wrote books I wanted to read. I never wrote for anyone but myself. Well, me and the editor I sold it to, but that was secondary. And I really enjoyed doing it, but it was a kind of a catch-as-catch-can kind of existence. I get these big fat checks 2 or 3 times a year. In between, I was getting by on $35 a month from FNSF and freelance sales. And all of it added up to barely getting by. But I said to myself, when I'm in my old age, my royalties will support you. You may all laugh. Right now, the majority of my books are in print, but only as e-books. And I get royalty statements twice a year from the British publishers who've done them. And They show that I've earned out about half of my advance now on 10 books. So someday maybe there'll be some royalties, but not yet. There are a lot of painful lessons that laid in wait for me when I was a young man. I thought all major science fiction writers were like Robert Heinlein, handsome, well-to-do, debonair men about town, the Mont Cranston types. and it was so far from the truth. Even Heinlein wasn't really like that, and he wasn't a very nice man either. But I found horribly disillusioned because he was my favorite science fiction writer for 20 years. Robert Sheckley, who was a good friend of mine, essentially died destitute. And he had a movie. Didn't do him that much good in the long run. It hasn't done most science fiction writers much good in the long run. I'm not sure it's done any pulp writers very well in the long run, except for those who broke out of the genre and had mainstream success, became bestsellers, or moved on to movies and became scriptwriters. But I have to say, I think writing fiction is more of an avocation than a profession these days. And I notice that increasingly, people who are writing are self-publishing. Some with success, but I gotta say, most of them probably couldn't sell that stuff if they tried to find a real publisher. You know, it's not that good. You need someone to talk to you when you're learning how to write. You know, you need a writer's group, or you need a really friendly editor who's willing to walk you through a number of rewrites. And then you need the patience to do it. But, oh well. My career as a science fiction writer is not totally, but mostly behind me. My last book was published years ago. My last story was published a couple of years ago. I had a story in Analog. My first sale to Analog in all this time. Back in the 60s, I sent a story called The Peacock King to John Campbell at Analog. It was so ultimately published in FNSF, and it's been anthologized a number of times. I wrote it with a friend of mine named Larry McClung. And it is, as far as I can tell, the first psychedelic science fiction story. It's about astronauts being trained to use hyperspace, which involves total mental disorientation. So they train them with psychedelics. And it turns out a good thing they did, because they lose their spaceship in the middle of the flight and have to find it. All of this in the mental hyperspace that they're kind of in. And for a minute, the protagonist is, I don't know whether he was naked or just not, he was minimally clothed, in space, in the vacuum of space. And John Campbell rejected the story with a 2-page letter in which he went into considerable detail about how scientifically inaccurate this was and how anyone exposed to the vacuum of space would blow up. And I knew that was flat wrong, because I knew about tunnel workers digging tunnels under the the East River for subways in the early part of the 20th century. There was a tunnel blowout, and one tunnel worker was blown up through the bottom, the silt bed of the river, and through God knows how many feet of water, and erupted in a water spout, and he lived to tell it. Now, he was in an environment where the air was compressed to about 50 pounds per square inch. And he was reduced to, what is it, 6 or 7 pounds per square inch that we have? 14, okay. Whatever it was a significant differential, and he did not explode. He may have had some ruptured veins in his eyes or something, but he lived to tell it. So I knew this was wrong. What I didn't know was that Campbell had been involved in what amounted to a feud with Arthur Clarke over this very point the previous 10 years, and I had unwittingly stepped into the crossfire. If any of you saw 2001, that's Clark's answer to Campbell. So at any rate, that's a little sideline there. I learned also in those days, when I was submitting stories, that it really helps to have a field, lots of editors in it, lots of markets, because every editor has his or her idiosyncrasies. You know, there's always certain things that they won't want to buy that somebody else will. You don't necessarily know what those are. People found out in the 50s that H.L. Gold was agoraphobic, and that if you set your story in a confined space, he liked it better. And that's true. I first heard that from Robert Silverberg. He figured it out and immediately started selling stories to Gold. I mean, Gold did not leave his apartment for years. And when finally he was talked into leaving his apartment, he was in a taxi that was in an accident. And that was the end of his leaving his apartment. His wife, Evelyn, was his spokesperson. Well, that's a sideline, but I'm full of them. How are we doing on time? It's about time to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, I think at this point I've hit all the high points. We haven't talked much about editing, amazing, and fantastic, but that's all in print. I mean, that's all accessible to you, so I don't really think I need to get to it. I myself am a fan of SF, pulps, and comic books, as well as jazz, progressive rock, and a variety of other things. I'm in a band right now. We've put out 54 albums thus far. They haven't sold much, but we don't care. Everything has to be a hobby.
He's in a band.
Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Someone? Yes.
I just wanted to say that they have lousy distribution in the town where I grew up. Finally, one day, I found a science fiction magazine. This was May 1972. It was this one. You were the editor. I loved it. I had a great experience in my first science fiction magazine. I want to say thank you. I read for many other years. Also, did you do the other reprints like Science Fiction Adventure?
No. I washed my hands of the reprints. While we had reprints and amazing, fantastic underneath, they were selected by a fellow named Arnie Katz, who was, I think, on the masthead for that period. But of course, I pushed them out of the magazine as quick as I could.
Well, anyway,
But Cohen put out all these other things with shifting titles. The greatest science fiction stories ever told, I think, was one of them. Some such, I regarded them as garbage myself.
People associate with amazing like yourself with the greatest stories to tell. You normally don't hear from the mainstream science fiction histories I've been reading for the last 46 years. In the past couple of years, there have been books like Man from Mars, Ray Palmer's Amazing Pulp Journey, War Over Lemuria, and Pulp Magazine's A to Z by Earl Kemp and Louis Ortiz.
Earl is a good friend of mine.
Yeah. What do you think of those books? Do you have any comments, positive?
I haven't read them, so it's very hard for me to have a comment on them. I'd like to read the Palmer one. Palmer was my hero when he was doing Other Worlds. I wanted Amazing to have all the characteristics that I most admired in Other Worlds. Strong editorial personality, good letter Palmer. That was my goal with Amazing and Fantastic, was to evoke what Palmer had evoked in me.
Well, they were interesting books I recommend to you and everybody else. Thank you again for your wonderful work.
Thank you. Yes.
The Great Gold Deal, was that a deal between you and Marvel, or did they just come looking and you were there?
Well, like everything else in my life, that's a social thing. I was friends with Stan Lee. We had met doing an after midnight radio call-in show at Columbia University and hit it off and liked each other, did some hanging out together. What happened was that Otto Binder, who was the old Captain Marvel writer and also a science fiction writer in his youth, as Ian O. Binder, iRobot, he had failed to get his foot in the door as a Marvel Comics writer with Stan Lee. Stan didn't feel that Otto understood the Marvel style that Stan had launched with Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. And so Otto made an end run around Stan, and he went to, what's his name, the guy who owned the
Yeah, Martin Goodman.
Martin Goodman, yes. He went to him and talked him into letting Otto do some books, fiction prose books, based on Marvel characters. But Goodman was too smart to let him have Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, but he would let him have some of the lesser ones like Avengers and Captain America and whatnot. Well, and Otto went to Bantam Books and sold this to them. And he did write the Avengers book himself. Well, when Stan found out about this, he was really upset. And he told the people at Bantam, listen, if you're going to do this, get Ted White. He'll do a better job. Now, I had been asked to write for Marvel, but I had turned it down because I didn't think I could do something that was all dialogue balloons. I didn't feel comfortable with that format, I guess. Roy Thomas was a good friend of mine, and he used to ask me, would you like to do this with me? They had sample pages of pencil art that they would give you as a test, see how you would supply the balloons for it. And I said, I don't want to do that. I can't do that. I'm not good at that. Don't worry about that. But so along comes the Bantam deal, and at Stan's urging, I got to do the Captain America book. And my agent, who had been previously trying to sell Bantam the idea of me doing a Batman book. And then Bantam had found out that they couldn't do any Batman or Superman books because Signet had the rights to those DC characters because they were all independent news distributed. So Bantam was primed to know who I was. So when Stan said, get Ted White, well, they had it coming in from two directions by then. So I went in and had a very pleasant meeting with the vice president of Bantam where we discussed how much we both liked Ross McDonald, which they were publishing. And I walked out with a contract on a handshake. And the contract was unique in my experience because this is a work for hire. This meant I didn't own the property. And normally when that's done, you just get one payment, flat payment. You don't get royalties. But my agent negotiated a royalty contract whereby if the book went into subsequent printings, I got subsequent additional payments for each printing, which is the way the Italians do it, by the way. They don't pay you royalties. They pay you for the entire print run. God bless them. So my book was, I wrote it in the fall of 1966. It was supposed to come out in January, February of 67. It was short order writing. And in January of 67, Otto's book comes out. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's dreadful. It isn't in any respect a good book. The first chapter consists solely, for a number of pages, of descriptions of the costumes worn by each individual member of the Avengers. You know, more than a page of description of each Avenger's costume. You know, what color it is, what color the briefs are, what color the belt, the cape, you know, all that crap. I mean, no storyline, no plot, no hook to grab the reader and pull him in. Well, apparently, very few readers are pulled in because the book tanked for Bantam. They were so unhappy with it, even though they had my book delivered to them, they put off publishing it for almost a year and a half. They didn't publish it until spring of '68. And I suppose by then they kind of figured, like, we don't publish it, it's a dead loss, so let's get it out, forget about it. Of course, the timing was all wrong by then. In January of '67, the Batman TV show was still on the air, and there was this huge, faddish interest in comic books. There were publishing paperbacks that were reprints in black and white of Marvel Comics. And I think they may have been doing that with Superman and Batman too, different publishers. And for a little while, there was this nice little wave you could kind of crest along on for sales. But by spring of '68, it had come and gone. It had been gone for nearly a year. And my book did well enough that it sold out its first printing, but not well enough to do its second. So I never saw more royalties. And I blame Otto Binder entirely.
I always hoped that there was gonna be another one. I mean, I liked the Great Gold Seal, and I was hoping it was under contract. Now I understand why, that we never got a second one.
I had a lot of fun writing it. It took only 2 weeks to write. It wrote itself. It wrote itself without an outline.
And I think the principle that you added there with Cap when he was buried in when the subway collapsed on him, and he got skinnier to rebuild the damage to his body. I've seen that used time and time again in other places and hadn't seen it used until then.
I'll tell you what my favorite scene was. My favorite scene is where they unmask him. They've captured him. They take his mask off. They all look at him and they say, I don't know. I've never seen him before. Because Steve Rogers was totally anonymous. So that was fun.
Yeah, it was interesting.
I'm getting the word here. I think it's time to wrap it up.
Okay, folks, let's have a big hand.
I have a question to ask. Is Claire McDonald in this room?
Yes?
Well,
I'd like to meet you, Claire.
Claire is a science fiction and pulp fan who traveled from Australia to PulpFest.